Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Los Angeles, California. Monday, December 8th, 2014. At about 7:30 in the morning, calm in the Fairfax district broke apart with sudden violence. Residents inside the palazzo at Park La Brea heard the unmistakable sound of gunshots, followed by a woman's scream that echoed through the walls of the upscale apartment complex. One neighbor picked up the phone and called 911. Within minutes, LAPD patrol units were rushing toward the 300 block of South Hauser Boulevard, their priority clear. Stop the threat, secure the building, and find out what had just happened behind those closed doors. The initial reports gave little to go on. Shots fired, possibly more than one, and a woman crying out. Officers arriving at the scene immediately contained the floor and moved residents out of the corridors. The uncertainty was palpable. Was there an active shooter moving through the building? Was someone being held hostage inside? Nothing was clear, except that a weapon had already been fired, and a woman's scream suggested someone inside was in imminent danger. Because of those unknowns, command treated the situation as a barricade. SWAT was called to stage outside. Tactical protocol required a deliberate entry. Rushing too quickly risked escalation. Waiting too long risked lives. It is a balance investigators and officers know too well. Contain the scene, buy time, and enter only when they can do so safely. By then, nearby residents had been told to shelter in place. The hallways of the complex, usually busy with people heading to work on a Monday morning, went silent. From the outside, nothing appeared disturbed. No signs of forced entry on the apartment door. No shattered glass. No evidence of anyone fleeing through the stairwells or elevators. The quiet itself was unusual. If shots had been fired, why hadn't anyone come running out? This was one of the first anomalies officers logged. The building was sealed, the violence seemed contained within a single unit, and nothing suggested an intruder had come or gone. When authorization was finally given, SWAT made a controlled entry. They moved methodically from room to room. It didn't take long. Inside, they found two adults. Both were motionless. Paramedics were brought in quickly, but the outcome was clear. Within minutes, both individuals were pronounced dead at the scene. On the floor, investigators located a handgun. The weapon was secured immediately. At that moment, the apartment transformed from a possible hostage scene into a confirmed homicide investigation. Detectives from LAPD's homicide unit were called in. The coroner was notified, and a chain of custody for every item in the apartment was established. No one outside the investigative team would enter until every step had been logged. What they already knew was significant. There was no evidence of forced entry, no reports of a third party running through the building, no sign of a break-in. Everything pointed to the violence beginning and ending inside that single apartment. Neighbors confirmed what they heard, a woman's scream followed by clustered shots. The exact order of events would need to be reconstructed, but the initial statements were consistent. By late morning, one of the victims was identified as Stephanie Elise Moseley, a 30-year-old Canadian-born dancer and actress. In the entertainment industry, her name was not unfamiliar. She had performed alongside Beyoncé, Janet Jackson, Jennifer Lopez, and Chris Brown, and more recently had been a cast member on VH1's scripted series Hit the Floor. To her neighbors, she was the young woman they passed in the building's lobby or parking garage. To law enforcement, she was now the victim in an apartment that had suddenly become a crime scene. For detectives, the first steps were about fixing the facts. A call logged around 7:30 a.m., neighbors reporting screams and gunfire, officers arriving within minutes. SWAT making entry, 2 bodies found inside, a firearm recovered. No secondary scene, no outside pursuit. Those facts would become the backbone of the timeline. Even in these early hours, one thing was already clear. This was not a case with a mystery suspect lurking outside. Everything had happened within 4 walls. The violence began there, and it ended there. The question then was not where to search, but how to piece together what unfolded between the first scream and the final shot. Could anything have changed the outcome? Were there warning signs? And how did a promising career in entertainment collide so violently with a fatal morning inside a Los Angeles apartment? The apartment that morning became the single focal point of the investigation. After tactical officers secured the unit, homicide detectives stepped in. They knew immediately that this would not be an extended manhunt across Los Angeles. The violence had started and ended in one place, inside a luxury apartment that was now sealed as a crime scene. The initial walkthrough was clinical. Every corner of the apartment was logged, photographed, and marked for potential evidence. The weapon was recovered quickly and placed into chain of custody. It would later be examined for fingerprints, ballistics, and firing sequence, but in those early hours, the priority was preservation. Nothing could be disturbed until each element had been recorded. Investigators noted that the front door showed no signs of forced entry, supporting what patrol officers had already observed. This was not a case of an intruder breaking in. The two bodies were found in close proximity. Paramedics had pronounced them dead at the scene, and the coroner's office was notified to conduct the removals. The process was deliberate. Photographs, trajectory mapping, and placement diagrams were created before anything was moved. Forensic technicians measured distances, noted positions of shell casings, and documented the condition of the room. These details might later confirm or contradict testimony, but more importantly, they created an unchangeable record of what the apartment revealed on entry. One important procedural anomaly stood out. Despite neighbors reporting multiple shots, the scene was remarkably contained. There was no evidence of stray rounds tearing into the walls or traveling outside the apartment. The violence was confined to a single room, which meant reconstruction of the sequence would be more precise. Each casing and bullet strike could be matched to the weapon recovered. Detectives also turned attention to digital devices. Phones, tablets, and laptops were identified, tagged, and bagged. At this stage, investigators did not yet know what those devices would yield, but the priority was to preserve data before it could be altered or lost. In homicide investigations, digital traces often carry as much weight as physical evidence. Call logs, message histories, and application activity can provide context that the scene itself cannot. The apartment's silence now contrasted sharply with the chaos described by neighbors minutes earlier. Witnesses had heard a woman's scream followed by shots, yet inside there was no sign of a struggle spreading through the space. No overturned furniture, no evidence of a drawn-out fight. The crime unfolded quickly within the span of minutes and then ended. The victim was confirmed as Stephanie Moseley. Her identification was straightforward, as her professional career and residence in the building were already known. Notification to family and next of kin would follow, a painful step that investigators never take lightly. At this stage, detectives did not announce publicly who the second individual was. That determination and the classification of manner of death would be reserved for the coroner. The apartment now served as both a silent witness and a record of choices. Every casing, every bullet hole, and every item out of place offered a data point for reconstruction. Detectives began mapping those data points into a timeline, aligning them with the 911 call, patrol arrival, and the sounds reported by witnesses. As the evidence was processed, questions began forming. If no one had forced entry and no one had left the building, what dynamics inside the apartment escalated to fatal gunfire? Was there any chance for intervention between the first scream and the last shot? Investigators could not answer yet, but they now had a room full of evidence waiting for analysis. The story for the public was still limited. Police confirmed that 2 adults were found dead inside the unit, that a firearm was recovered, and that there was no threat to the wider community. Beyond that, no names were released. It was a cautious approach, facts only, no speculation. For the entertainment industry, however, word was spreading. The confirmation that Stephanie Moseley was among the deceased carried weight far beyond Los Angeles. She was a performer with an established reputation, and her death would ripple quickly through networks of colleagues and fans. But for investigators inside that apartment, the attention outside was background noise. Their task remained precise: document, preserve, and prepare the evidence for the next phase. When investigators closed the door on the apartment in Los Angeles, their attention shifted to evidence that could not be captured with photographs alone. The gunshots had already been heard by neighbors, but to reconstruct the sequence of events, detectives needed to anchor those sounds in time. In homicide work, aligning witness perception with hard data is often the difference between speculation and fact. This stage was about clocks, records, and the invisible signals that tracked activity in those final minutes of December 8, 2014. Dispatch confirmed that the 911 call came in just after 7:30 a.m., The caller described multiple shots, followed by a woman's scream. Radio logs from patrol officers responding showed that units were on site within minutes. These timestamps are precise, leaving little margin for debate. Investigators compared them directly with the testimony of neighbors who reported hearing the shots. Most statements fell within the same narrow window, clustered bursts of sound that ended almost as soon as they began. The short duration mattered. It suggested that the incident unfolded quickly, not as a drawn-out exchange. The next step was digital forensics. Officers collected the phones found inside the apartment. Those devices were immediately placed into evidence and data extraction began. Even in 2014, phones recorded a vast amount of metadata. Call records, text logs, application activity. Detectives were cautious. They knew from experience that not all reported communications would survive scrutiny. What the media later described as a FaceTime call was categorized internally as reported until it could be verified through device logs. This distinction is critical. Courts require more than rumor. They require timestamps, duration, and digital signatures that can be authenticated. Alongside the digital work, detectives interviewed neighbors again to capture detailed statements. Where exactly were they when they heard the shots? How many bursts did they recall? Did they hear anything between the scream and the final gunfire? These questions seem routine, but they help triangulate perception against the mechanical certainty of call records. Sometimes memory drifts, especially under stress. By documenting it early, investigators reduce that drift before it hardens into conflicting testimony. An anomaly did emerge. Several neighbors described hearing no additional movement after the shots. No voices, no footsteps. The silence struck them. For investigators, this observation was entered as negative evidence. The absence of sound can be as important as its presence. It reinforced what the apartment scene already suggested, that the violence ended as quickly as it began, leaving nothing in motion afterward. Chain of custody for every record was logged. And officers noted when devices were seized, when they were booked into evidence, and when forensic teams accessed them. These protocols prevent defense challenges later, ensuring that no gaps appear in the custody timeline. Even in a case that seemed to point inward, procedure demanded precision. Forensic specialists then began aligning digital traces with the external clock. If the victim's phone showed activity shortly before the 911 call, it might anchor what she was doing. If the second phone logged a call or message, it might indicate state of mind or escalation. These are the questions digital forensics is built to answer. The process is technical, but the implications are deeply human. Every entry in a call log represents someone trying to reach out, someone sending a message, or someone choosing silence. Investigators in this case were aware of the risk of information spreading faster than confirmation. Entertainment news outlets were already speculating by midday. But inside the LAPD, the focus remained narrow. Tie together the timestamps, confirm the sequence, and prevent unverified claims from being treated as fact. The detectives understood something simple but critical. In high-profile cases, the narrative builds itself if investigators do not ground it in evidence. The picture that emerged from this phase was consistent: a scream, multiple shots, then silence. No evidence of anyone entering or leaving. No forced entry. No signs of a secondary participant. Just two people in a locked apartment and a chain of events that ended in minutes. The digital analysis was ongoing, but the foundational timeline was already strong. What remained unresolved was motive. Why that morning? Why that apartment? And why with such finality? Investigators did not speculate in their reports. Their task was to establish sequence first, context second. The order mattered. In homicide investigations, establishing who the victim was is more than background detail. It is central to understanding why the violence occurred and what circumstances allowed it to escalate. Detectives working the Los Angeles case turned their focus to Stephanie Elise Moseley, not only her final morning, but the broader patterns of her life. Stephanie was 30 years old, born in Vancouver, Canada, and had built a career many aspiring dancers only dreamed about. She trained rigorously and broke into the entertainment industry with a resume that listed some of the biggest names in music. She had performed on stages with Britney Spears, Janet Jackson, Chris Brown, Jennifer Lopez, and Beyoncé. By 2014, she had also secured a recurring role on VH1's scripted series Hit the Floor, where her dancing and acting combined to give her visibility far beyond the stage. To her peers, she was disciplined and professional. To investigators, this established that she was not an isolated figure. She had a large circle of colleagues, friends, and associates whose accounts could help build context. Victimology examines not only the public face but the private circumstances. Detectives began gathering information from colleagues, neighbors, and acquaintances. Early statements described Stephanie as ambitious but grounded. Her schedule was demanding, with rehearsals, shoots, and travel often consuming her time. Yet colleagues also noted that she was devoted to her personal relationships, making the balance between career and home life a recurring challenge. In violent crime investigations, intimate partner contexts are a common vector, and detectives had to assess whether Stephanie had ever reported concerns or whether warning signs had been visible to those close to her. Preliminary interviews suggested that arguments had occurred in the relationship, but the scope and severity of those disputes required careful documentation. It was not enough to rely on hearsay. Investigators needed corroboration. As part of standard protocol, detectives also pulled public records, prior police reports, any protective orders, and any calls for service at the address. At the time, there were no protective orders filed in Los Angeles County under Stephanie's name. This was important. It meant that law enforcement had not previously intervened in a way that created a documented paper trail. However, the absence of records does not equal absence of risk. Investigators understood that domestic tensions often go unreported until escalation reaches a critical point. Medical examiners' involvement added another dimension. Autopsy results, while handled with discretion, confirmed that Stephanie's cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds. Toxicology reports were also ordered, standard in cases where substance influence might have shaped the circumstances. This layer of forensic detail complemented what witnesses had already described: a sudden scream, gunfire, then silence. The escalation question still remained. Why that morning? Why so suddenly? Detectives began correlating text message data and phone records, looking for evidence of conflict or communication in the hours leading up to the event. If an argument had occurred, investigators needed to determine whether it was spontaneous or the continuation of an existing pattern. These findings were not yet complete in the early stages, but the process itself was clear. Isolate the hours before the crime, then widen the lens to weeks or months. This is where victimology intersects with prevention. Analysts reviewing the case noted that Stephanie's professional life was high profile, but her private life was less visible. The stressors of a public career can sometimes amplify tensions in a household, but investigators were careful not to speculate. Their task was evidence, not theory, yet the broader point remained. Intimate partner violence often escalates behind closed doors, and without external intervention, the trajectory can be swift and irreversible. From a community perspective, the case carried a message that extended beyond one apartment in Los Angeles. When a victim is well known publicly, the reality of domestic violence becomes harder to ignore. It forces difficult questions. How do we recognize warning signs, and what structures are in place to respond before tragedy occurs? Detectives compiled their findings into the case file, knowing that each step, from witness interviews to phone record analysis, would later be scrutinized by prosecutors and possibly the public. Consistency was essential. The narrative of the case could not fracture into competing versions. By this point, investigators had aligned three pillars: the physical evidence from the scene, the digital evidence anchoring the timeline, and the emerging victimology profile of Stephanie Moseley. Together, these painted a picture of a life with professional success and personal complexity. A woman who had earned her place on international stages, but who, in private, faced dynamics that would never be visible to her audience. When detectives in Los Angeles wrapped the first 48 hours of investigation, they faced a unique legal and procedural question. What happens when the suspect in a homicide is deceased at the scene? In many crime cases, the immediate next step is building a charging theory for prosecutors. But in this case, the scenario shifted. With both Stephanie Moseley and her husband Earl Hayes found inside the apartment, the work of the LAPD, the coroner, and the district attorney's office became less about preparing a trial and more about documenting responsibility with absolute clarity. The charging theory in a murder-suicide must still be supported by evidence. Forensic technicians photographed and cataloged the firearm recovered on site, a semi-automatic handgun registered to Hayes. Ballistics analysis confirmed that the recovered bullets matched the weapon. Gunshot residue tests were conducted on both victims. Preliminary results aligned with the hypothesis that Hayes discharged the weapon. These findings were essential, not for the courtroom, but for the record, the family, and the public. In high-profile cases, the absence of doubt matters. LAPD homicide detectives also coordinated with the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office to ensure the evidence was sealed and entered properly into the record. Even without prosecution, case files must be complete. Future reviews, whether by oversight boards or media requests, would demand the same consistency as any active trial. Interagency communication played a significant role. The Los Angeles County Coroner's Office delivered its autopsy findings in tandem with law enforcement updates. The conclusion was clear. Stephanie Moseley's death was a homicide, and Earl Hayes' death was ruled a suicide. Toxicology screenings were ordered as part of routine protocol, and no results suggested external involvement. In parallel, the LAPD's Communications Division managed the case as a media event. This was not a crime that could remain in the shadows. News outlets were already running headlines within hours, identifying Stephanie's television role and Hayes' ties to the music industry. The LAPD had to confirm facts carefully. The names of the deceased were not released until next of kin notification was complete, even though reporters speculated early. Detectives and public information officers knew that any contradiction between what police confirmed and what the media circulated could damage the credibility of the case file. Charging theory also intersected with firearm tracing. Investigators requested an ATF trace on the handgun to ensure no irregularities in purchase or ownership. Records showed Hayes had acquired the weapon legally. This eliminated potential side theories about outside suppliers or trafficking. Again, these details mattered not because charges would be filed, but because the official case summary had to withstand scrutiny. A complicating factor in murder-suicides is community perception. Without a surviving defendant, some families feel justice is incomplete. Detectives addressed this by ensuring transparency. They briefed Stephanie Moseley's relatives on the forensic findings, walking them through the evidence chain. It was not a courtroom proceeding, but it gave the family documentation that the case was not left in limbo. Forensic psychologists were also consulted. In high-profile murder-suicides, agencies often request behavioral analysis to identify risk factors. In this instance, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit did not formally open a file, but local experts noted the combination of industry stress, marital conflict, and access to a firearm as converging points. Their findings were included in internal reports, offering future cases a comparative framework. By this stage, the LAPD could no longer treat the matter as an open homicide investigation. The evidence aligned too consistently: weapon, ballistics, residue, autopsy. There was no indication of third-party involvement. The case file transitioned toward closure, but not without careful review by supervisors to ensure procedural accuracy. For the entertainment community, the agency response also carried weight. Stephanie's colleagues and friends required answers not only through the press, but through the clarity of law enforcement records. The message was not speculative, it was factual, forensic, and definitive. The interagency work underscored an important principle. Even when prosecution is not possible, a complete case file honors the victim. It creates a record that can stand against rumor, misinformation, and speculation. In the eyes of investigators, that is its own form of justice. December 8, 2014 would never be forgotten inside the Los Angeles Police Department. By midday, the case that had begun as a volatile domestic disturbance had been formally documented as a murder-suicide. Detectives working in tandem with the coroner's office finalized findings that tied together physical evidence, autopsy results, and the absence of alternate suspects. The death of Stephanie Moseley was now ruled a homicide. The death of Earl Hayes was ruled a suicide. There would be no charges, no trial, no cross-examinations, yet the procedural burden remained heavy. The case file still required meticulous assembly for official closure and for the sake of the victim's family. The critical difference in a case like this, investigators often explained, was that when the offender died on scene, the file did not simply vanish. It became what is known as a closed exceptional clearance. It is not dismissed, nor is it left open. It must stand as a complete record, capable of scrutiny by family members, the media, or even future investigators. In practice, that meant every report, every photograph, every toxicology result needed to align without contradiction. Autopsies offered the final layer of certainty. The Los Angeles County coroner confirmed that Moseley had died from multiple gunshot wounds, primarily to the head and torso. Hayes, by contrast, had sustained a single self-inflicted gunshot wound. Gunshot residue patterns, ballistic trajectories, and firearm matching all corresponded to the Glock handgun recovered at the scene. There was no evidence of a second firearm, no latent prints from outsiders. Negative evidence was as crucial as positive. No forced entry to the apartment, no signs of a struggle beyond what was consistent with the gunfire itself, and no digital footprint suggesting the presence of anyone else in those final minutes. Toxicology testing was standard. Investigators needed to know if intoxicants played a role. The report confirmed the absence of heavy narcotics but did identify alcohol in moderate levels. That detail mattered procedurally. It helped explain impaired judgment, but it did not shift responsibility. Forensic analysts emphasized the sequence was deliberate. The weapon was lawfully in Hayes' possession and the shots were fired intentionally. These distinctions separate an avoidable accident from an act of crime. By the time detectives briefed their commanding officers, the narrative was clear. At approximately 7:30 a.m., a neighbor reported multiple gunshots and a female scream. Within minutes, officers secured the Camden Apartments at South Hauser Boulevard. Within that same hour, SWAT entry confirmed 2 victims inside, unresponsive. Later that day, autopsies began. Within 48 hours, ballistics, digital communication reviews, and toxicology converged. By the end of the week, the case was stamped as closed by homicide detectives. The classification, murder-suicide. That closure, however, was bureaucratic. For Stephanie's family, friends, and colleagues in the entertainment industry, the loss was not paperwork. Law enforcement was tasked with delivering the news and guiding them through what would inevitably become a highly publicized grieving process. In cases involving celebrities, the department had to anticipate leaks. False narratives could spread faster than verified findings. This meant public information officers drafted statements that balanced compassion with accuracy. Stephanie Moseley had been the victim of a homicide. Earl Hayes had died by suicide. No further suspects were being sought. The public was safe. There is a quiet but important procedural tool investigators sometimes use in these cases: a psychological autopsy. Because Hayes would never stand trial, his motive would never be tested in court. Instead, detectives compiled accounts from friends, industry colleagues, and prior law enforcement contacts. The goal was not to excuse, but to document patterns: financial strain, marital conflict, jealousy over professional success. Multiple acquaintances referenced Hayes' ongoing distress over rumors of infidelity and career frustrations. Text messages retrieved from his phone in the days leading up to December 8th confirmed volatile mood swings and expressions of despair. Those findings supported the conclusion that his mental state contributed significantly to the sequence of violence. From a law enforcement perspective, the importance of documenting these psychological factors is twofold. First, it helps surviving family members understand what led to the tragedy. Second, it serves as a data point for future domestic violence prevention. Detectives know that every line in their report may one day be reviewed by social scientists, advocates, or trainers trying to prevent the next case. That is the community value hidden inside what otherwise appears to be a closed file. The entertainment industry's reaction underscored the broader cultural weight of the crime. Moseley was not only a dancer on VH1's Hit the Floor, but also a performer with global credits, having appeared alongside stars like Chris Brown and Britney Spears. Her murder was covered internationally. That coverage, while respectful, often pressed the department for details before investigators were ready to release them. Managing that flow became part of the casework. Detectives balanced investigative integrity with public transparency, knowing that speculation could compound the pain for Stephanie's family. By late December 2014, the coroner's report was public record. It left no ambiguity. Hayes' actions were deliberate, lethal, and final. Moseley's death was unjust, violent, and irreversible. The LAPD concluded its report with a formal determination: the offender deceased, the victim identified, the firearm recovered, motive partially supported by witness statements and digital communication. In the language of procedure, the matter was resolved. Yet to say resolved is not to say finished. Even years later, friends of Stephanie Moseley referenced her legacy. For law enforcement, cases like this highlight the limitations of intervention. Neighbors did call 911 quickly. Officers did respond within minutes. But in crimes of intimate partner violence, sometimes the window for prevention is tragically narrow. It is why departments across the country stress early reporting of threats, counseling resources, and firearm access restrictions in volatile households. The procedural conclusion becomes a social reminder. Silence and hesitation can be fatal. As the file closed, one reality stood. Stephanie Moseley's life ended in her own home, at the hands of the person she once trusted most. For investigators, that demanded not only documentation but respect. Case files can appear cold, lined with codes and acronyms, but at their center are real people whose stories deserve precision. That is why the final page of the homicide book reads in clear terms. Victim, Stephanie Moseley. Cause of death, multiple gunshot wounds, homicide. And directly beneath it, offender, Earl Hayes. Cause of death, self-inflicted gunshot wound, suicide. The impact on community safety statistics is minor. The impact on lives is immeasurable. True crime is not entertainment to detectives. It is a ledger of tragedy. The hope, as always, is that by analyzing the details, communities may learn to recognize warning signs earlier, to respond more forcefully to cries for help, and perhaps to prevent the next violent headline. That is the procedural end of this case, but not the end of its resonance. By mid-December 2014, LAPD had closed the file. The scene at Camden Apartments was logged, the weapon collected, the autopsies completed. Officially, it was clear. Stephanie Moseley died of multiple gunshot wounds. Her husband, rapper Earl Hayes, then shot himself. The case was marked a murder-suicide. The coroner's report matched witness accounts and 911 recordings. There were no contradictions. Toxicology results and phone records confirmed rising tension in the relationship. For investigators, this was not an unsolved crime, but a documented act of domestic violence. What followed was the industry shock. Colleagues across music and television spoke of Moseley's talent and professionalism. For police, these tributes reinforce the importance of accuracy. High-profile victims bring heavy scrutiny, and even one misstep in reporting can distort the record forever. From a procedural lens, the case carried 4 lessons. First, even rapid police response cannot always prevent firearm fatalities in domestic settings. Second, digital evidence, from texts to call logs, offers insight into motive, even without a trial. Third, exceptional clearance cases must still be proven to prosecutable standards. Fourth, public communication matters. Investigators must balance transparency with sensitivity. For Moseley's family, closure on paper offered little comfort. Yet detectives made sure every fact was preserved. That is how law enforcement respects both the victim's legacy and the historical record. By the close of the official investigation, the sequence of events was clear. On December 8, 2014, inside a luxury apartment complex in Los Angeles, Stephanie Moseley, a professional dancer and actress known for her role in VH1's Hit the Floor, was shot and killed by her husband, rapper Earl Hayes. Within moments, Hayes turned the gun on himself. Responding officers found both inside the unit, confirming a murder-suicide. The case was exceptionally cleared, as the identified offender was deceased. The timeline remained undisputed. Neighbors reported gunfire just after 7:30 a.m. Within minutes, a 911 call triggered LAPD's immediate response. Officers secured the building on South Hauser Boulevard, forcing evacuation of nearby residents while tactical units approached the scene. Inside, the pattern of gunfire matched reports, multiple rounds fired in close succession. The scene presented no ambiguity. Entry had not been forced. Investigators confirmed both parties were inside voluntarily. There were no signs of prolonged struggle, no anomalies suggesting third-party involvement. Hayes' firearm lay recovered near his body. Evidence aligned across 3 categories. Physical evidence, ballistic matches, trajectory studies, and autopsy reports confirmed cause of death for both. Stephanie by multiple gunshot wounds, Hayes by a single self-inflicted shot. Digital evidence from phone records and communications confirmed earlier domestic disputes and strained exchanges. Testimonial evidence came from neighbors, colleagues, and friends who described escalating tension in the relationship. Negative evidence, no signs of outside entry, no calls placed from Stephanie after the first shot, further supported the murder-suicide conclusion. Geography chain was consistent throughout. All activity was confined to the Los Angeles apartment. There was no evidence of travel or extended sequence across other jurisdictions. This made jurisdiction straightforward. The case remained entirely under LAPD and Los Angeles County Medical Examiner Authority. The ending was stark but definitive. Stephanie Moseley's death was ruled homicide. Earl Hayes' death was ruled suicide. No charges were filed. The file was closed with the designation murder-suicide, offender deceased. From a procedural perspective, investigators emphasized how quickly such incidents unfold and how difficult they are to prevent once escalation begins behind closed doors. The case underscored an all-too-frequent pattern of domestic violence ending in homicide. From a human perspective, the loss was devastating. Stephanie, remembered not just for her talent but for her presence in the entertainment community, was gone at just 30 years old. For the entertainment world, the crime reverberated as a warning. Fame and professional success do not shield anyone from domestic risk. For investigators, it served as another reminder that behind each closed case file are lives, families, and communities forced to cope with irreversible loss. Case status: murder-suicide. Another reminder of how crime leaves behind questions no verdict can fully answer. When I look back at this story, what stays with me is not only the tragedy itself, but the reminder that crime often grows out of silence, fear, and unresolved conflict. Stephanie Moseley's life was cut short, and it reminds us how important it is to notice the signs of danger in our homes and communities before it's too late. In sharing this case, I hope it serves as both a warning and a call to compassion, because no one should ever feel trapped in a situation that turns violent. Now I'd like to hear from you. What lessons do you take from this case? Have you seen situations where early intervention could have saved someone? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know where you're watching from too. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next crime story we bring to light. Together, by remembering and reflecting, we make sure these tragedies carry meaning beyond the headlines.